I accidentally found my late husband's old bank account. There was $83 million in it. He always said we were poor, and his salary was $700 a month. When I called the bank, the manager said 3 words: "I am Simone, 32 years old, and somehow still breathing after the devastating tragedy that shattered my world." I accidentally found my late husband Darius's old bank account and stared at the balance in absolute shock. There was $83 million sitting right there in black and white. He always told me we were poor and that his freelance consulting salary was exactly $700 a month. When I called the bank, the manager went completely silent before he said 3 words that turned my entire world upside down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like garbage by wealthy in-laws who thought you were beneath them. 3 days after Darius was lowered into the cold ground, I was sitting on the floor of our cramped one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, packing his clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. The familiar scent of his cedar cologne still lingered heavily in the air, making my chest physically ache, with a grief so profound I could barely breathe. Suddenly, my front door was shoved open with aggressive force. They did not even bother to knock. My mother-in-law, Geraldine, strutted into my living room, wearing a black designer morning dress that cost more than my entire apartment lease. Right behind her was her golden child daughter, Jasmine, and Jasmine's arrogant white husband, Preston. Preston looked around my small living room with visible disgust before he reached into his custom-tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a piece of paper and tossed it onto my cheap plastic dining table. It was a check for exactly $5,000. "Pack your bags and get out of this apartment by 5 o'clock this evening," Preston demanded, his voice dripping with absolute authority and condescension. Darius owed my real estate company a massive debt, and I had to cover his pathetic funeral costs out of my own pocket. "We are not running a charity for ghetto strays. You need to be gone before I call the property manager and have you thrown out like trash." I stood up slowly, feeling a cold and clinical anger replacing my crushing grief. As a forensic accountant, I was used to dealing with hostile corporate takeovers, but this was a blatant and illegal violation of my basic human rights. I walked over to the table, picked up the check, and tore it straight down the middle. Then I tore it again, dropping the pieces onto the floor right in front of Preston's expensive leather shoes. "I am legally on this lease," I told him, keeping my voice completely steady and refusing to show fear. "You have zero authority to evict me, and I do not want your dirty money. Get out of my home immediately." Jasmine scoffed and rolled her eyes dramatically. She lunged forward with her manicured hands reaching directly for my left hand. "Take that cheap cubic zirconia off your finger," Jasmine shrieked, trying to yank my wedding ring right off my hand. "Darius probably stole it from our mother's jewelry box anyway. You do not deserve to wear anything connected to our family name." I shoved her back hard. Jasmine stumbled backward into Preston, clutching her chest as if she had been brutally attacked. "Do not ever touch me," I warned her, stepping forward to hold my ground against the three of them. Geraldine sneered at me, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace with a look of pure contempt. "You really thought marrying my son was your ticket out of the hood, didn't you?" Geraldine mocked, her words designed to inflict maximum pain. "You thought you hit the jackpot. He made $700 a month. He was a struggling failure who refused to join the family business, and you are just a glorified bookkeeper with no class. You two losers deserved each other. Now give us the ring and walk away before we make your life a living hell." I pointed directly at the open door, refusing to back down. "I will call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing if you do not leave right now." Preston grabbed Jasmine's arm and glared at me with menacing eyes. "You have until 5 o'clock, Preston threatened before turning around. The three of them marched out of my apartment, leaving the door wide open. My hands were shaking violently as I locked the door behind them. I needed to finish packing before they tried another illegal tactic. I went to the closet and pulled out the old, heavy metal toolbox Darius kept hidden in the back corner. As I lifted it by the handle, the rusty latch snapped under the pressure. The toolbox crashed onto the hardwood floor, sending wrenches and screwdrivers flying everywhere. When it hit the ground, the bottom panel of the metal box popped entirely loose, revealing a hidden compartment. It was a false bottom. I knelt down and saw a thick manila envelope wedged inside the secret space. I pulled it out and opened the flap. Inside was a pristine, heavily embossed bank statement from Sterling Private Wealth, a highly exclusive financial institution in downtown Atlanta. My eyes scanned the heavy paper. The account name read Darius and Simone Irrevocable Trust. I blinked hard, sure that my grief was making me hallucinate the numbers. I looked at the balance line, $83,450,000. The gravity of those massive numbers hung in the air, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. My husband, the man who clipped coupons and budgeted our grocery runs with meticulous care, was a multimillionaire. The toolbox lay empty on the floor, a physical representation of the secrets Darius had taken to his grave. I stared at the bank statement, tracing my finger over the $83 million balance, realizing that my life was no longer defined by the poverty my in-laws so viciously mocked. I was holding the key to an empire, and I was about to use it. My breath caught in my throat as my mind raced to comprehend the massive fortune. I flipped the page over and saw a priority VIP hotline number printed at the bottom with a handwritten security pin next to it in Darius's messy, familiar handwriting. Trembling, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. A man answered immediately, introducing himself as Mr. Sterling. I read the security pin aloud and identified myself as Simone, the wife of Darius. The bank manager went completely dead silent on the line. The silence stretched for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Mr. Sterling spoke, and his voice was thick with deep emotion. He uttered 3 words that changed my reality forever and shattered every lie my in-laws had ever told. He owns everything. Before I could even begin to fully process the 3 words Mr. Sterling had just spoken, I realized I had not eaten a single thing since the morning of the funeral. I grabbed my purse and walked down the street to the local cafe to buy a simple black coffee and gather my racing thoughts. When I handed my debit card to the barista, the credit machine beeped loudly. The digital screen flashed a bright red declined message for everyone in line to see. I knew I had exactly $2,000 in that joint checking account just yesterday. I stepped aside, apologizing to the barista, and pulled up my banking application on my phone. I felt a sickening drop in my stomach as the screen loaded. The balance showed absolutely zero. Preston had illegally used his corporate banking connections and his unearned racial privilege in the financial sector to completely freeze and drain the joint checking account I shared with Darius, leaving me with absolutely no money to my name. It was a calculated and cruel tactic designed to starve me out and force me onto the harsh streets of Atlanta before the sun even set. I did not go back to the apartment to cry or feel sorry for myself. I hailed a passing cab and promised the skeptical driver my silver watch as payment to take me directly to the financial district. I stormed through the heavy glass doors of Sterling Private Wealth, demanding to see Mr. Sterling immediately. An elite black financier in an impeccable charcoal suit greeted me directly in the luxurious marble lobby and rushed me past the curious tellers into a heavily guarded soundproof vault. Mr. Sterling sat me down at a polished mahogany conference table and handed me a crystal glass of water. He opened a massive leather-bound corporate ledger and revealed the absolute truth about my late husband. Darius was not a struggling freelance consultant. He was the anonymous founder and the 100% majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. My jaw dropped open in pure disbelief. Apex Holdings was the exact multi-million-dollar real estate empire that Preston currently operated as chief executive officer. Preston and Geraldine had built their entire high society reputation on a corporate entity that my husband secretly owned and controlled. Mr. Sterling explained that Darius faked his poverty for years, deliberately living a modest life in our small apartment. As the anonymous owner, he had been quietly gathering forensic evidence of Preston and Geraldine severely embezzling company funds to support their lavish country club lifestyles and designer wardrobes. Darius hid his immense wealth to protect me from their toxic greed, while he prepared a massive legal trap to destroy them and reclaim his empire. He knew they would target me if they knew about the money, so he played the part of the struggling son perfectly. Now that he was gone, the entire estate and all its power defaulted entirely to me through the irrevocable trust. I was now the sole owner of the company that employed the very man who just tried to evict me. As I was absorbing this massive revelation, my cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. It was a text message from Jasmine. I opened it and saw a picture of my husband's beat-up old Honda being towed away from my apartment complex by a massive truck. Jasmine followed up with a cruel voicemail that I played right there in the silent vault. Preston just filed a mechanical lien on Darius's ugly old car. Jasmine taunted, her voice dripping with pure malice and cruel satisfaction. "We are taking everything, Simone. You are walking to the homeless shelter today, sweetie. Do not even try to fight us because my white husband will crush you in any courtroom in this city. You are completely powerless." Immediately after that venomous voicemail ended, my phone pinged with an urgent email from Geraldine. She had drafted a vicious social media post, branding me as a gold-digging black widow who drove her struggling son to an early grave through my constant financial demands. She threatened to publish the fabricated story to all the major Atlanta gossip blogs if I did not immediately sign a legal waiver giving up any rights to Darius's personal belongings and life insurance policies. They were attacking me from every possible angle, trying to break my spirit and force me into total submission. They wanted me destitute, humiliated, and entirely erased from their pristine family narrative. I did not shed a single tear over their petty threats. I looked at the threatening messages on my screen and then looked across the mahogany table at Mr. Sterling. My forensic accountant instincts were fully activating, sharpening my mind into a deadly analytical weapon. I was no longer the grieving widow begging for basic respect from a family that despised me. I was the majority shareholder of their entire existence. I picked up the solid gold pen resting on the table and confidently signed the irrevocable power of attorney forms, transferring full operational control of the $83 million into my direct and unquestioned command. I slid the thick stack of paperwork back to Mr. Sterling with a perfectly calm and chilling smile. "Mr. Sterling, I want you to override Preston's corporate black card right now," I instructed, keeping my voice dangerously steady and devoid of any hesitation. "Cancel his entire executive credit line and flag his accounts for highly suspicious fraudulent activity. Put an immediate hard stop on all his company expenditures. Let us see exactly how the arrogant chief executive officer pays for Jasmine's luxury birthday dinner at the Capitol Grill tonight when his plastic gets rejected in front of all his wealthy friends." The game they started was about to end, and I held all the winning cards. Laughter echoed through the private dining room of the Capitol Grill in downtown Atlanta. Jasmine sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a diamond necklace. Geraldine raised her champagne flute, offering a toast to her golden child. The table was covered in Wagyu steak platters and wine bottles. They were celebrating Jasmine turning 30 with excessive spending. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, radiating unearned arrogance. He loosened his silk tie and snapped his fingers loudly at the young black waiter. "Bring the check," Preston demanded, waving his hand dismissively. "And make it quick. We have a private yacht party waiting on Lake Lanier." The waiter approached and placed the black leather folder on the table. The total came out to $12,000. Preston smirked at Jasmine before pulling a black card from his wallet. He tossed it onto the folder. "Take care of that," he told the waiter. "Keep a $500 tip for yourself if you process it fast enough." The young man took the folder and walked away. Geraldine patted Jasmine on the arm. "You deserve the best, darling," Geraldine said. "Preston has done wonders for Apex Holdings." Less than 2 minutes later, the waiter returned. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He placed the leather folder back on the table, but the corporate black card was sitting on top of the receipt. "I am so sorry, sir," the waiter said, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing attention from the other tables. "Your card declined." Preston froze. His smug smile vanished instantly. He snatched the card off the table and glared at the waiter. "Are you incompetent?" Preston asked, his voice rising in volume. "This is an unlimited corporate account for the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. Run it again, and this time do not mess up the numbers." "I did run it twice, sir," the waiter replied, maintaining his professional composure despite the blatant disrespect. The system returned a hard stop code. The account has been frozen. Preston turned bright red. His white privilege flared up as he slammed his fist on the table. "Listen to me, you idiot," Preston shouted. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this entire restaurant and fire you on the spot. You probably entered the security code wrong." Jasmine gasped, looking around nervously as other wealthy patrons began to stare at their table. "Preston, calm down," Jasmine whispered, grabbing his arm. "Just use another card. People are watching us." Preston yanked his wallet out again. He pulled out a platinum card and threw it at the waiter. "Run this one." The waiter walked away silently. Geraldine fanned herself with a napkin. "This is why I hate dining downtown," Geraldine muttered. "The service is always so incompetent." The waiter returned a moment later holding the platinum card. "Declined, sir." Preston stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He pulled out 2 more credit cards and slammed them onto the table. "Run both of these. Now." The waiter did not even have to leave the table. He pulled a portable payment terminal from his apron and inserted the first card. A loud negative beep echoed in the quiet room. He inserted the second card. Another negative beep. "Declined, sir. All of them." A suffocating silence fell over the table. Jasmine looked at Preston in absolute horror. Geraldine clutched her chest, breathing rapidly, as the realization set in that they could not pay a $12,000 dinner bill in front of Atlanta elite. "Allow me to handle that." The voice came from the doorway, clear and perfectly composed. Geraldine, Jasmine, and Preston whipped their heads around. I walked into the private dining room wearing a flawless, custom-tailored emerald green designer suit. The sharp cut of the fabric and the subtle gold accents created a visual contrast so striking it left them speechless. I was no longer the grieving widow in cheap funeral clothes. I stepped up to the table and dropped a pristine, solid metal bank card directly onto the leather folder. "Charge the entire $12,000 to my account," I told the waiter, offering him a polite smile. "And add a $2,000 tip for dealing with his temper tantrum." The waiter nodded and handed me the receipt. Preston stared at me, his face twisting with rage. He looked at my expensive suit and then at the metal card in my hand. "Who did you sleep with to get that suit?" Preston sneered. "You are just a glorified bookkeeper. Did you steal money from my company to pay for this?" I looked him dead in the eye, not stepping back a single inch. "A forensic bookkeeper who just bought the commercial lease to this exact restaurant," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "I finalized the wire transfer 20 minutes ago. So enjoy the birthday cake, Jasmine. You are officially dining on my property." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Geraldine looked like she was going to faint right into her empty plate of Wagyu beef. Preston gritted his teeth, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "You think you are smart," Preston threatened. "You think buying one restaurant makes you untouchable. I am the chief executive officer of the biggest real estate empire. I will completely destroy your career. I will make sure no accounting firm ever hires you again. You will be begging me for a job by next week." I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the pocket of my emerald jacket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen once, sending a single automated command through the secure server Mr. Sterling had helped me establish. "Check your email, Preston," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "You have been locked out of Apex Holdings mainframe." Preston ripped his phone from his pocket, staring at the glowing screen. His face drained of color as a red access denied error flashed across his company email application. He furiously tapped the screen, trying to bypass the firewall, but my lockdown command was absolute. Jasmine leaned over his shoulder and gasped loudly, drawing even more attention from the wealthy patrons around us. "You will pay for this, you insolent brat," Preston spat, his voice trembling with humiliation and rage. He grabbed Jasmine by the arm and stormed out of the dining area, leaving Geraldine trailing behind them. They could not look the waiter in the eye as they fled my property. I took my seat at the mahogany table and ordered sparkling water. The war had officially escalated, and I knew Preston would not go down without trying to use every dirty trick his white privilege and corporate connections could buy him. At 6 a.m, a violent pounding shook the thin wooden door of my apartment. "Wake up and get out," a harsh voice boomed from the hallway. "Sheriff Department. Open this door right now or we are breaking it down." I did not flinch. I knew exactly what this was. Preston called in a favor from a corrupt sheriff he often used to illegally intimidate low-income tenants out of their properties. He bypassed the legal eviction process, thinking my recent grief and working-class background made me an easy target. I could hear the heavy thud of a battering ram scraping against the hallway walls as the deputies prepared to shatter my door and throw my belongings onto the street. They wanted to break my spirit and drag me out in pajamas while my neighbors watched in pity. I unlocked the deadbolt and swung the door wide open before they could strike. The corrupt sheriff raised his hand to signal his deputies to halt. He looked at me with a menacing sneer, holding a fake eviction notice printed on standard county paper. "You have 10 minutes to grab your clothes and vacate the premises," he commanded, resting his hand heavily on his duty belt to intimidate me. "The property management company reported you as a hostile squatter. We are clearing this unit immediately by order of the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings." I did not back away. Instead, I stepped aside and motioned toward my small living room. Standing right behind my cheap plastic dining table were 3 of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigators in Atlanta. Mr. Sterling had dispatched them to my apartment at dawn. They wore immaculate tailored suits and held thick leather briefcases, looking completely out of place in my modest apartment, but perfectly ready for a legal bloodbath. The lead attorney, a tall black man with a commanding presence, stepped forward and handed the sheriff a thick stack of documents stamped with federal seals. "You are currently trespassing on private property without a valid warrant." The attorney stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "My client Simone is not a squatter and she does not pay rent to the property management company anymore. As of midnight last night, the irrevocable trust she controls purchased this entire residential complex in a cash transaction. She is the sole owner of this building and you are conducting an illegal raid on her private residence." The sheriff snatched the paperwork and scanned the federal injunctions. His face turned a sickly gray as he realized the eviction notice Preston gave him was completely worthless. He looked at the 3 high-powered lawyers, and then back at me, realizing he had just walked into a massive federal lawsuit that could cost him his badge and his pension. "We are leaving now," the sheriff mumbled to his deputies, aggressively shoving the fake eviction notice back into his pocket. He did not even apologize, as he turned around and marched his men down the hallway. I walked out onto my small balcony and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, enjoying the crisp morning air. A black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb right in front of my building. Geraldine stepped out of the passenger side wearing an oversized sun hat and a smug smile. She had come to watch me cry on the sidewalk, surrounded by garbage bags full of my clothes. She looked around expecting to see me humiliated and broken by the sheriff deputies. Instead, she looked up and saw me standing calmly on my balcony, sipping tea and looking down at her. Geraldine ripped off her sunglasses and glared at me, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "You disgusting thief," Geraldine screamed, pointing her manicured finger up at my balcony for the entire neighborhood to hear. "You stole the identity of my son to access his accounts. You hacked into his company. Darius would be sick to his stomach if he saw you right now. You belong in a jail cell, you absolute fraud." I set my teacup down on the small metal table. Her toxic words used to cut me deeply, but today they sounded like the desperate cries of a woman losing her grip on reality. She still thought she held the power in this dynamic. She still believed her status could shield her from the consequences of her greed. I walked back inside, grabbed a pristine legal envelope from my kitchen counter, and made my way down the stairs to the street level. I walked right up to Geraldine, cutting off her frantic screaming. I shoved the heavy envelope directly against her chest, forcing her to grab it before it fell. "I am not being evicted." "Geraldine," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "But you are. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate the Buckhead mansion. Apex Holdings owns that estate, and as the sole owner of Apex, I am officially terminating your lease." Exactly 24 hours later, I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling Buckhead estate. The massive iron gates were already forced open by the elite private security firm Mr. Sterling had contracted for me. I stepped out of my sleek black town car, wearing a sharp crimson blazer perfectly tailored to command the room. The towering limestone mansion stood before me, a monument to the extravagant lifestyle my in-laws had funded with my late husband's stolen money. But today that era was officially over. A loud crash echoed from the second-floor balcony. A priceless Ming Dynasty vase shattered onto the cobblestone driveway, missing my lead security officer by mere inches. Geraldine stood on the balcony, leaning over the marble railing with her hair disheveled and her designer silk robe slipping off her shoulder. She grabbed another antique porcelain bowl and hurled it toward us. "You are not taking my home!" Geraldine shrieked, her voice hoarse and frantic. "I am the matriarch of this family. I built this legacy. You are just a filthy street rat who seduced my son. I am not leaving. I will die inside these walls before I let a miserable gold digger throw me onto the street." I did not flinch as the porcelain shattered into dust near my leather heels. I looked up at her, calmly checking my diamond watch. "You have 10 minutes left on your eviction notice, Geraldine," I stated, my voice amplified by the quiet tension of the affluent neighborhood. "You can walk out the front door with your dignity, or my security team can drag you out in handcuffs for trespassing and assaulting private contractors. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking." Before Geraldine could grab another projectile, the heavy oak front doors flew open. Jasmine rushed out onto the porch, dragging Preston by the hand. She was sobbing hysterically, mascara running down her cheeks, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Several wealthy neighbors had stepped out onto their manicured lawns, drawn by Geraldine's screaming. Jasmine saw the audience and immediately capitalized on the moment to play the ultimate victim. She pointed a trembling finger at me, loudly weaponizing her husband's race to manipulate the affluent onlookers. "Look at her!" Jasmine wailed, projecting her voice toward the neighboring estates. "Look at this crazy, bitter black woman attacking my innocent white husband out of pure jealousy. She is a violent squatter who faked a legal document to steal our property. Preston has done nothing but provide for this family. She hates him because he is successful and white. Someone call the police. She is trying to ruin a good man." Preston puffed out his chest, standing tall next to his weeping wife. He crossed his arms, attempting to look like the stoic protector shielding his family from an irrational aggressor. He played right into Jasmine's calculated racial theatrics, hoping the wealthy neighbors would call the authorities and force my security team to stand down. I slowly walked up the front steps, closing the distance between us until I was standing inches away from Jasmine. She stopped her fake sobbing, her eyes widening as she saw the absolute lack of fear in my expression. I unclasped my crimson blazer and reached into the inner pocket. I pulled out a thick bound stack of heavily audited corporate tax returns and bank routing ledgers. "I am not attacking him because he is white. Jasmine," I said, projecting my voice clearly so every neighbor watching from the street could hear the absolute truth. "I am evicting him because he is a criminal." I tapped the heavily highlighted financial documents against Preston's chest. "I am evicting him because he wired exactly $14 million of Apex Holdings capital to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Preston's arrogant posture instantly crumbled. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He tried to snatch the documents from my hand, but my lead security officer immediately stepped forward, blocking him with a massive frame. Jasmine wiped her eyes, genuinely confused for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Jasmine demanded, looking from the documents to Preston. "He was investing that money for a new commercial development. He told me it was a confidential corporate acquisition." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "A commercial development," I echoed, flipping to the second page of the ledger and shoving it right into Jasmine's line of sight. "Look at the beneficiary name on the routing number, Jasmine. Does that look like a corporate entity to you?" Jasmine stared at the page. Her eyes frantically scanned the highlighted text. The name on the Cayman Islands account was not Apex Holdings, it was Ashley Kensington. "That is his 22-year-old blonde receptionist," I stated coldly, watching the realization physically strike Jasmine like a freight train. "He did not invest $14 million into real estate. He stole my company's capital to fund a luxury island getaway for his mistress. He has been funneling money to her for 2 years right under your nose. He bought her a yacht while you were defending his honor to the neighbors. Jasmine froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. Preston could not meet her gaze. He looked down at the porch, sweating profusely, his hands trembling as the undeniable truth hung heavily in the air. "Baby, I can explain," Preston stammered, backing away from his wife. "It is a misunderstanding." Before they could explode into a domestic war, a loud, rumbling sound echoed down the street. A massive industrial moving truck backed into the driveway, crushing Geraldine's prized rose bushes. The back doors swung open. Half a dozen burly movers began carelessly tossing velvet couches and crystal lamps onto the lawn. Jasmine watched her reality shatter. "Get off my grass," I commanded. Preston grabbed his weeping wife by the arm and dragged her toward his luxury sedan, leaving Geraldine screaming obscenities from the sidewalk as my security team formed an impenetrable human wall around the estate. They were humiliated and homeless, but Preston was far from finished. A man like him, accustomed to buying his way out of every consequence, would never just walk away. He retaliated using the only weapon he had left, which was his wealth and his connections in the media. Less than 48 hours after I kicked them to the curb, my phone started buzzing relentlessly. I opened my browser and saw my face plastered across every major local news site and gossip blog in Atlanta. The headlines were vicious and coordinated. They branded me a gold-digging black widow who preyed on a vulnerable man. The articles claimed I drove a struggling and depressed Darius to an early grave through my relentless financial demands and extravagant spending. Preston had hired a ruthless public relations firm to orchestrate a massive smear campaign. They fabricated a narrative portraying Darius as a tragic victim of my greed, completely omitting the fact that Darius was a secret multimillionaire who owned the very company Preston worked for. The fallout was immediate and brutal. I received an urgent call from the senior partner at the independent forensic accounting firm where I had worked for the past 4 years. He sounded incredibly nervous, avoiding my questions before finally telling me that I was terminated, effective immediately. He claimed the firm could not afford the overwhelming negative press associated with my name, my professional reputation. The career I had built from the ground up with sleepless nights and sheer determination was seemingly in ruins. To make matters worse, Geraldine took the smear campaign a step further. She went on a highly rated local podcast hosted by a prominent Atlanta socialite. I sat in my newly reclaimed mansion, listening to the audio as Geraldine Fake cried into the microphone. She spun a sickening tale about how she tried to save her precious son from my abusive grasp. She claimed I isolated Darius from his loving family and manipulated his finances until his heart simply gave out from the stress. She played the role of the grieving, devastated mother, perfectly using her tears to manipulate the public into viewing me as a monster. My phone was blowing up with hateful messages from people who believed the lies. My security team advised me to release a statement or go on social media to defend myself and set the record straight. I refused. I did not shed a single tear, and I certainly was not going to beg the public for validation. Explaining myself would only give Preston the attention he desperately wanted. It would put me on the defensive. I was not playing defense anymore. I called Mr. Sterling and told him to prepare the boardroom at the bank. I drove downtown in complete silence, my mind calculating every single variable. When I walked into the private vault, Mr. Sterling had a team of corporate acquisition lawyers waiting for me. I placed a printout of the public relations firm on the table. "I do not want to sue them," I told the legal team. "I want to buy the parent media conglomerate that owns them." Mr. Sterling smiled, adjusting his glasses. He slid a thick portfolio across the desk. "The parent company is Vanguard Media Group. They are currently publicly traded, but their stock has been underperforming. A hostile buyout will require significant capital and aggressive market maneuvering." I did not even blink. "Use the $83 million," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Liquidate whatever assets are necessary. Offer a premium on the shares that the board of directors cannot possibly refuse. Buy 51% of the voting shares, and do it before the stock market closes today. I want total controlling interest. The lawyers went to work immediately executing the most aggressive and rapid hostile takeover the Atlanta financial sector had ever seen. While Preston was busy paying bloggers to write fake stories about my marriage, I was buying the entire printing press. By sunset, I was the majority shareholder and the ultimate boss of the very media empire Preston was using to destroy me. I made one single phone call to the executive producer of the morning news broadcast at Vanguard Media Group. I informed him that there had been a change in ownership and gave him a very specific set of instructions for the morning broadcast. I provided him with a secure encrypted file containing the exact audited tax returns and offshore banking ledgers I had shown Jasmine on the porch. I told the producer to run the story as an exclusive breaking news special and promised to double his salary if he executed it flawlessly. The next morning, Preston woke up in his cramped luxury hotel room feeling incredibly smug. He poured himself a cup of expensive coffee and turned on the television, fully expecting to see another morning talk show discussing my ruined reputation. He settled into the couch with a satisfied smile, waiting for my name to be dragged through the mud once again. The morning news anchor appeared on the screen looking serious and urgent, but the anchor was not talking about a gold-digging widow. The screen transitioned to a massive, glaring graphic. Preston dropped his coffee mug onto the floor, watching the hot liquid splash across his expensive shoes. The news anchor was displaying Preston's secret Cayman Islands offshore bank account numbers live on the air, detailing exactly how he had embezzled $14 million from Apex Holdings to fund a lavish lifestyle for his mistress. He was completely exposed to the entire city, and his absolute destruction had officially begun, and he could not run from it anymore today now. Preston stared at the television as the news anchor dissected his hidden offshore accounts. Color drained from his face and his coffee mug slipped from his trembling hands, shattering against the marble floor. Panic seized him. He grabbed his phone, immediately dialing his corporate secretary to demand an emergency board meeting at Apex Holdings within the hour. Preston knew he had one final desperate move left to save himself. He had to execute a hostile dilution of the company shares. If he could force the board of directors to issue millions of new phantom shares directly to himself, he could dilute the anonymous founder's equity to less than 5%. That would strip Simone of her controlling interest, cementing his absolute power over the empire before authorities could freeze the assets. Preston rushed into the glass skyscraper of Apex Holdings, his tailored suit sticking to his sweating back. He slammed his briefcase onto the polished mahogany table in the executive boardroom. 7 confused board members sat around the table murmuring about the disastrous news broadcast. Geraldine sat at the far end, occupying a plush chair. She had appointed herself as an executive consultant, despite having zero corporate experience. She glared at the board members, daring them to question her white son-in-law. Preston cleared his throat loudly, demanding order. He projected a fabricated financial crisis on the screen, claiming the company was under a cyber attack. He presented an emergency resolution to authorize the immediate printing of 10 million new executive shares. The board members hesitated, looking at the glaring discrepancies. Preston slammed his fist on the table, using intimidation tactics to bully the room into submission. He demanded a vote right that very second. The chairman of the board reluctantly raised his hand to approve the illegal motion. Before a single word of confirmation could leave his mouth, the frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung violently open. Every head turned. I strode into the room wearing a tailored obsidian black pantsuit that radiated absolute authority. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence. I did not look like the grieving widow they had tried to toss onto the street. I looked like the true owner of the building. Geraldine leaped out of her luxury chair, her face contorting with sheer outrage. She pointed a manicured finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Security, get in here right now!" Geraldine shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "Remove this crazy trespasser immediately. She is a squatter who has been stalking my family. Call the police and have her dragged out in handcuffs." 2 large security guards rushed into the boardroom, reaching for their radios. I did not flinch. I calmly reached into my designer briefcase and pulled out a stack of embossed legal documents stamped with the federal seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I tossed the thick stack of papers onto the center of the mahogany table. I looked at the security guards with a deadly calm expression. I own 80% of this entire corporation, I stated, my voice cutting through Geraldine's hysterical screaming. I sign your paychecks. If either of you takes one step closer, you will both be unemployed before you reach the lobby. The guards froze, looked at the federal seals, and immediately backed out of the room, closing the doors behind them. Preston turned a sickly shade of gray, but his arrogance refused to let him surrender. He slammed both of his hands onto the mahogany table, leaning forward to tower over me. He tried to use his race and his position to intimidate me into submission. "You have absolutely no power here," Preston shouted, his voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing but a ghetto accountant playing dress-up." Darius was a weak, pathetic loser, and his shares died the exact second his heart stopped beating. "The corporate bylaws clearly state that I am the sole successor to the chief executive position. I run this empire now." I stared right into his panicked eyes. "You are not a successor, Preston," I replied, stepping closer until there was zero space for him to hide. "You are a parasite. You used your privilege to walk into a black-owned business and drain it dry. You thought Darius was just a quiet, subservient tech guy you could walk all over. You had no idea he built this company from the ground up while you were busy stealing $14 million to buy a yacht for your mistress." The board members gasped, exchanging shocked glances as the pieces finally clicked together. They realized they had been taking orders from a thief currently under federal investigation. Geraldine clutched her pearl necklace, hyperventilating as her false reality disintegrated. "You are a liar," she gasped desperately, trying to protect her stolen wealth. "My son loved me. He trusted Preston." I offered Geraldine a chilling smile. "Let us ask him," I suggested. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I pressed a single button. The heavy magnetic locks on the boardroom doors clicked, engaging an automatic lockdown. We were completely sealed inside. I pressed another button, and the automatic blackout blinds descended over the floor to ceiling windows, plunging the room into darkness. A projector silently dropped from the ceiling, casting a massive bright image against the far wall. The screen flickered to life. Darius appeared on the video. He looked tired, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. The entire boardroom stopped breathing. Preston took a terrified step backward, bumping into the conference table. Darius leaned forward, looking directly at the camera lens with a cold, calculated stare. His voice echoed through the high-fidelity surround sound speakers, filling the locked room with a haunting warning. "If you are watching this," Preston Darius stated, his voice steady and devoid of fear, "it means I am dead. And it means you killed me." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Every executive sat paralyzed in their ergonomic leather chairs as Darius continued to speak from the massive projection screen. His voice was a clinical hammer smashing through years of carefully constructed lies. "Preston, you thought you covered your tracks perfectly," Darius stated, holding up a thick-bound ledger to the camera. "You thought utilizing dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands would mask the funneling of Apex Holdings capital? You transferred $12 million over the past 18 months, classifying them as anonymous international vendor payments. I let you do it. I sat in my cramped apartment, making you believe I was a clueless $700 a month contractor while I built a digital backdoor directly into your encrypted hard drive." The screen split in half. On the left side, Darius remained seated. On the right side, a rapid scroll of bank routing numbers, transaction dates, and authorized signatures flashed for everyone in the room to see. The executives gasped. The numbers matched the exact financial deficits the company had been quietly bleeding from for a year. "But you did not act alone," Darius added, his eyes narrowing. "You needed someone with legacy access to override the internal audit alerts. Someone who cared more about maintaining her elite status at the Buckhead Country Club than the survival of her own son." The camera feed zoomed in on a specific signature at the bottom of a fraudulent authorization form. It was Geraldine. You signed off on the forged expense reports, Mother Darius said, his voice thick with a mixture of disgust and heartbreak. You authorized the draining of my equity so you could afford your weekly cosmetic surgeries and lavish charity galas to impress a high society circle that secretly despises you. You sold your own flesh and blood for a seat at a table you do not even own. Geraldine let out a high-pitched shriek. She looked around the boardroom, desperately seeking an ally, but the executives were staring at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The powerful matriarch image she had projected for decades evaporated in an instant, exposing the greedy parasite underneath. Realizing she was completely trapped in a locked room with federal documents sealing her fate, Geraldine resorted to the only tactic she had left. She clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling to the back of her head. She let out a dramatic, suffocating gasp and collapsed violently onto the polished hardwood floor. "Help me!" Geraldine wheezed, thrashing her legs against the base of the conference table. "My heart is failing. The stress of these vicious lies is giving me a massive heart attack. Call an ambulance immediately." The room erupted into sudden chaos. Two board members jumped out of their seats, entirely panicked by the medical emergency. Preston saw his golden opportunity. With the executives distracted by Geraldine performing her theatrical medical crisis, Preston lunged across the mahogany table. He vaulted over the leather chairs, sprinting directly toward the projector mounted on the ceiling. He grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the center console, rearing his arm back to smash the expensive lens and destroy the visual evidence. He actually thought destroying the hardware would magically erase his digital footprint. He was dead wrong. Before the crystal pitcher could even leave his hand, my lead security officer intercepted him. The massive guard tackled Preston midair, slamming him brutally against the reinforced glass wall of the boardroom. The pitcher shattered onto the floor, mixing with the spilled water and broken ice. A second guard rushed forward, grabbing Preston's wrists and violently pinning them behind his back. "Let me go, you ignorant thugs!" Preston screamed, his face pressed against the cold glass, his white privilege completely useless against the physical force of private security holding him accountable. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation. I will have you arrested for assault." I did not even blink at his desperate screaming. I casually stepped over the shattered glass and walked toward the center console. I hit the intercom button, connecting directly to the building security desk. "Send the paramedics up to the executive suite," I instructed, my voice echoing over the chaotic shouting. "We have a woman experiencing a highly convenient medical emergency." Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy magnetic doors unlocked. 4 emergency medical technicians rushed into the boardroom with a stretcher and heavy trauma bags. They immediately knelt beside Geraldine, who was still putting on a spectacular performance, wailing and clutching her chest while demanding to be taken to a luxury private hospital. The paramedics quickly strapped a blood pressure cuff to her arm and prepared to lift her onto the stretcher. The board members backed away, giving the medical team space while my security guards kept Preston firmly pinned against the glass wall. I walked slowly toward the stretcher, looking down at my mother-in-law as she hyperventilated. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out a slim digital tablet. I tapped the screen, once pulling up a highly classified document my forensic software had unearthed just hours ago. It was a massive fraudulent life insurance policy taken out on Darius shortly before his death. I crouched down next to the lead paramedic. I held the tablet up so only the medical professional could see the forged signature at the bottom of the multi-million-dollar payout request. The signature matched Geraldine's handwriting perfectly. "Make sure her heart is healthy enough for federal prison," I whispered to the paramedic. The paramedic stared at the glowing screen, his eyes widening as he recognized the severity of the crime displayed before him. He nodded, keeping his expression entirely neutral. Geraldine continued to thrash wildly against the stretcher straps, unaware that her theatrical performance had just supplied me with the perfect distraction to lock her inside a criminal investigation. I stood up and smoothed my tailored suit. The trap was completely sealed. The boardroom doors clicked shut as paramedics wheeled Geraldine to her indictment. I stood alone, feeling the weight of absolute victory. But my peace lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, I sat at my executive desk, ready to wire funds to secure the final shares of Apex Holdings. I typed the authorization code. A red notification flashed across my monitor. Account frozen by court order. My phone rang immediately. Mr. Sterling sounded furious. Jasmine had just detonated a legal grenade. Desperate to avoid poverty, she filed a highly contested backdated will in the Fulton County Probate Court. The fraudulent document claimed Darius revoked his trust and left his estate to his sister as his only true blood relative. Normally, a judge would spot the discrepancies and throw it out, but Preston was not playing by the rules. He utilized his white privilege and elite country club connections to bypass standard legal protocols. He called the presiding judge a corrupt man who was his regular golf partner. The judge fast-tracked the injunction and issued an emergency freeze on the $83 million without granting me a preliminary hearing. I was completely locked out of my own empire. My phone buzzed on the glass desk. A text message from Preston illuminated the screen. "You are back to being a broke nobody. The game is over. Grab your cardboard boxes and go back to the hood." I stared at the message, feeling a familiar fire ignite in my chest. Preston actually believed freezing my funds would freeze my brain. He forgot I was a forensic accountant who spent my career hunting down financial criminals just like him. I did not waste time crying over the locked accounts. I called my legal team and demanded an immediate digital copy of the forged will Jasmine submitted. Within 10 minutes, the file arrived in my secure inbox. I booted up my proprietary forensic analysis software and ran a deep diagnostic sweep on the document. I ignored the forged signature and dove straight into the digital metadata embedded inside the file. Criminals always leave a digital fingerprint. The extraction took less than 60 seconds. The software revealed the exact creation date of the file. Jasmine and Preston drafted the fake will on a registered Internet Protocol address located at their Buckhead mansion exactly 3 days after Darius passed away. It was a sloppy, desperate forgery, but proving that in a corrupt court would take months. I needed an immediate tactical nuke to destroy their fake will today. I closed my laptop and paced the office. Darius was a financial genius who anticipated every possible angle of attack. He knew his family was vicious, and he knew Preston had corrupt judges in his pocket. Darius would never leave my entire future vulnerable to a single local injunction. I thought back to the very first clue he left me. I grabbed my purse and pulled out the original bank statement I found hidden in the false bottom of his metal toolbox. I laid the heavy paper flat on my desk and examined it closely. I had been so overwhelmed by the $83 million balance that I ignored the transaction history printed on the second page. I ran my finger down the column of numbers. None of the withdrawal amounts made any logical financial sense. The decimals were placed in bizarre locations. I grabbed a pen and transcribed the digits onto a notepad. My heart hammered against my ribs as the random numbers formed a distinct, recognizable pattern. It was a sequence of precise global positioning coordinates followed by a secure routing code. I typed the coordinates into a secure encrypted mapping program. The location did not point anywhere in Atlanta. It pointed to a heavily fortified private depository hundreds of miles away. The vault was in Chicago, Illinois. Darius hid the ultimate failsafe far outside the jurisdiction of Preston's network. I knew what I had to do. If Preston realized I was onto his forgery, he would send his private security thugs to confiscate the original bank statement and destroy the coordinates. I needed to get to Chicago immediately before the corrupt judge could issue a travel ban against me. I could not use my regular identification or any corporate accounts tied to Apex Holdings. I pulled a prepaid burner phone from my desk drawer and contacted a private aviation broker I trusted. I booked a mid-sized private jet out of a small regional airport using my maiden name and a secure offshore account I had set up years ago for emergencies. I packed nothing but my briefcase, my laptop, and the original bank statement. I slipped out through the underground parking garage, avoiding the main lobby where Jasmine might be waiting to gloat. My private driver navigated through the heavy Atlanta traffic, taking a convoluted route to ensure we were not followed. The airport was quiet and deserted when we arrived. I walked through the terminal, my heels clicking against the concrete floor. The desk attendant handed me my boarding pass and directed me toward the tarmac where the sleek white jet was already waiting with its engines softly whining. I stepped into the humid Georgia air feeling a massive surge of adrenaline. I was one flight away from securing the weapon that would obliterate my in-laws permanently. The pilot stood near the stairs, offering a polite nod. "We are ready for immediate departure, ma'am," the pilot stated, gesturing toward the cabin. I grasped the handrail and took my first step up. A deafening screech of heavy tires ripped through the quiet afternoon air. I whipped my head around. A massive black sport utility vehicle tore through the flimsy chain-link security gate, sending sparks and twisted metal flying across the asphalt. The vehicle accelerated wildly, roaring straight toward me. The tinted windows rolled down, revealing two men in tactical gear. Preston tracked my burner phone. His goons had found me. I threw myself up the metal stairs of the private jet, just as the black sport utility vehicle slammed into the boarding staircase. The impact jolted the entire aircraft, throwing me forward onto the carpeted floor. "Close the door," I screamed at the flight attendant. The pilot did not hesitate for a single second. He jammed the throttle forward, and the jet lurched down the runway before the men in tactical gear could recover from their violent collision. I collapsed into a plush leather seat, watching through the small oval window, as Preston's hired thugs faded into tiny black specks on the Georgia asphalt. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but my forensic mind immediately began calculating my next tactical move. Preston had compromised my burner phone. He knew my exact destination. I ripped the battery out of the device and tossed it into the trash bin to sever the tracking signal. By the time we touched down in Chicago, the freezing wind whipping across the tarmac felt like a stark warning. I stepped off the plane and ducked straight into the waiting town car I had prearranged through an encrypted channel. "Drive to the financial district," I told the man behind the wheel. "And do not stop for anything." We barely cleared the airport exit before two unmarked black vehicles aggressively swerved out of a parking lane and boxed us in from behind. Preston had a network everywhere. His unearned privilege and stolen wealth bought him eyes and ears in every major city. "Hold on tight, Mom," my driver shouted, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. We merged onto the highway, weaving recklessly through the dense Chicago traffic. The black vehicles stayed locked onto our rear bumper, aggressively shunting civilian cars out of their way. I gripped the leather armrest, bracing myself, as we violently swerved off the main expressway and plunged into the dark labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive. The subterranean tunnels of Chicago were a chaotic concrete maze, completely shielded from global positioning system tracking. The driver killed our headlights. We plunged into total darkness, navigating the sharp concrete pillars by memory alone. The squeal of heavy tires echoed off the underground walls as our pursuers overshot a sharp right turn and slammed brutally into a solid concrete median. We shot out of a hidden service exit, leaving Preston's thugs trapped and wrecked in the subterranean gloom. "Keep driving," I instructed, my voice remarkably steady. "Take me to the depository." The heavily fortified private depository looked like an abandoned warehouse from the outside, but the interior was a fortress of solid steel and biometric security. I walked through the bulletproof glass doors and presented a coded access card to the armed guard. He escorted me down 3 flights of stairs into a subterranean vault lined with polished titanium safety deposit boxes. I stopped in front of box number 704. The biometric scanner glowed red, waiting for authorization. Darius always prepared for the worst. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a perfect silicone cast of my late husband's thumbprint. I pressed the cast firmly against the glowing glass scanner. The machine beeped a pleasant green tone, and the heavy titanium door clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick leather portfolio. My hands shook as I untied the leather string. Inside rested the original irrevocable trust document. The paper was pristine, but the signature line caught my immediate attention. Darius had not just signed it with standard black ink. He had placed a small fingerprint of his own blood directly over his signature, creating an undeniable physical seal that legally voided the fraudulent, backdated will Jasmine had submitted to the corrupt judge. I finally had the ultimate weapon to destroy her fake claim in any federal court. But the trust document was not the only item hidden inside the box. Lying beneath the portfolio was a heavy black leather ledger. I pulled it out and flipped open the thick parchment pages. As an elite forensic accountant, I can spot financial anomalies within seconds. I scanned the columns of handwritten names and astronomical dollar amounts. This was not a record of Apex Holdings' corporate real estate transactions. I instantly recognized the powerful names on the list. They were the most influential politicians, corrupt judges, and elite high society families in Atlanta. Preston was not just embezzling money from my company. He was using the stolen $14 million to pay out fake dividends to these elite investors. He was running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme and leveraging the entire criminal operation on the backs of wealthy investors who thought he was a financial genius. If this ledger went public, Preston would not just face a civil lawsuit for fraud. He would be facing multiple federal life sentences. He had successfully defrauded the most dangerous and powerful people in the state, and now I held all the evidence in my hands. A sudden, sharp vibration interrupted my racing thoughts. I looked down at the empty titanium box. A cheap, disposable burner phone was sitting in the very back corner, glowing brightly in the dim light of the vault. Someone was calling it right at that exact moment. My blood ran cold as I realized Darius had left the phone active and plugged into a battery pack for a specific reason. I reached in and pressed the green answer button, holding the cheap plastic device to my ear. I did not say a single word. A heavily distorted, digitally altered voice crackled through the tiny speaker, sending a chilling shiver down my spine. "If you have the ledger, you have exactly 24 hours to hand it over." The voice growled, dripping with lethal intent. "Or you will end up exactly like your husband." The line went completely dead, leaving me standing absolutely alone within the frozen concrete vault. I dropped the cheap plastic burner phone onto the cold concrete floor of the vault and crushed it beneath the heel of my boot. If Preston thought a distorted voice modifier and a cheap threat would make me cower, he severely underestimated the woman Darius married. I packed the heavy black ledger and the blood-sealed trust document into my secure titanium briefcase. I did not have 24 hours to wait around and play his twisted corporate games. I was bringing the financial war directly to his front door tonight. By 8 o'clock that evening, I was back in Atlanta, stepping out of a chauffeured town car in front of the legendary Biltmore estate. Preston and Jasmine were hosting their annual high-profile charity gala. It was heavily publicized across all local media as a prestigious philanthropic fundraiser for underprivileged youth, but the detailed ledger resting inside my briefcase proved the absolute sickening truth. The glamorous gala was nothing but a glittering front to launder their rapidly deteriorating public image and solicit fresh, massive capital from Atlanta's wealthiest black elite to feed Preston's collapsing Ponzi scheme. I walked past the red velvet ropes, completely ignoring the confused private security guards who failed to recognize the grieving, destitute widow they had been explicitly instructed to aggressively look out for. I stepped into the grand ballroom, wearing a custom-structured gold-sequined evening gown that caught every dazzling flash of the giant crystal chandeliers suspended overhead. Heads turned immediately in my direction. The low, comfortable hum of elite high society networking ground to an absolute halt as shocked whispers rippled through the massive sea of tailored tuxedos and expensive designer dresses. I spotted Preston and Jasmine standing arrogantly near a massive swan ice sculpture. Jasmine wore a brilliant diamond tiara that was undoubtedly purchased with my late husband's stolen equity. They were desperately trying to schmooze a group of high-net-worth real estate developers, pouring them expensive champagne and laughing at fake jokes. I did not march over to scream at them and cause a senseless emotional scene. I walked directly to the digital bidding tablets set up along the silent auction wall. Preston was attempting to publicly flex his fabricated wealth by placing maximum bids on every luxury item to financially impress the skeptical donors. He confidently bid $50,000 on a private vineyard tour. I tapped the glass screen and bid 100,000 using the untraceable offshore funds I had legally secured and routed directly from the Chicago vault. He bid 80,000 on a vintage sports car. I immediately countered with 200,000 without blinking. I systematically went down the entire long row of luxury auction items, obliterating every single bid Preston and Jasmine had placed, outbidding them by astronomical, undeniable margins. The digital leaderboards flashing above the main stage updated in real time, displaying my bold initials claiming every single expensive prize. Preston noticed the glowing screens. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar as he realized his display of ultimate wealth was being entirely publicly hijacked in front of his investors. Jasmine shoved her way fiercely through the dense crowd of wealthy donors, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated malice. She marched right up to me, aggressively grabbing my wrist with her sharp, manicured claws. "You are ruining my night!" Jasmine hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage as she tried to physically intimidate me. "You do not belong here. You are a broke, pathetic nobody who sneaked into a private, exclusive event. Security is going to drag you out by your cheap hair and throw you into the street where you belong." I calmly looked down at her trembling hand gripping my wrist, and then looked her dead in the eyes. "I strongly suggest you let go of me, Jasmine, before I buy this entire historical estate and have you arrested for criminal trespassing," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any fear or emotion. Jasmine snatched her hand back loudly, gasping as she realized I was not bluffing for a single second. Preston stormed over, grabbing Jasmine's shoulder to aggressively pull her back. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw, blinding panic. "I told you what would happen if you did not hand over that ledger," Preston threatened, dropping the fake public relations smile entirely. "You have absolutely no idea the kind of dangerous people you are messing with. They will tear you apart and leave nothing behind." I smiled at him, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the ledger resting securely in my briefcase. I brushed past his tense shoulder and walked purposefully toward the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly as I climbed the carpeted steps. I walked straight to the clear acrylic podium and grabbed the microphone. The entire ballroom of Atlanta's wealthiest elite fell completely silent, staring up at me in shock. I tapped the microphone twice, ensuring the audio was crystal clear. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice projecting across the massive room, echoing beautifully off the gilded walls. "We are all here tonight to celebrate generosity and transparency. On behalf of Preston and his beautiful wife Jasmine, I would like to make a monumental contribution to this evening's festivities." Preston froze, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors as he realized he had lost absolute control of the room. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified bank draft, holding it high in the air for every camera phone in the room to capture. "I am donating $5 million tonight," I declared, staring directly at Preston as the color completely drained from his face. "And I am donating this money directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division to assist in auditing his fraudulent charities." The entire room immediately erupted into a state of absolute chaos. The chaotic screams from the charity gala were still ringing in the back of my mind as the morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury hotel suite. I sat at the glass dining table, sipping black coffee, while sorting through the mountain of federal audit confirmations I had just triggered. The walls were rapidly closing in on their fraudulent empire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the rats started turning on each other. A frantic pounding on my suite door shattered the quiet morning. I did not even look up from my laptop. I pressed the security intercom button. My private bodyguard stepped into the frame, holding a highly agitated woman by her designer jacket. It was Jasmine. "Let her in," I instructed, my voice calm and detached. "I want to hear exactly what she has to say." The heavy wooden door swung open, and Jasmine practically collapsed into my suite. She shoved past the security guard and threw herself onto the expensive Persian rug, right at my feet. The sheer desperation radiating from her was pathetic. "Simone, please," Jasmine sobbed, clasping her hands together in a theatrical display of absolute misery. "You have to listen to me. You have to stop the federal agents. They were waiting outside our mansion this morning. I had nothing to do with any of it, I swear to you. He manipulated me. He controlled all the finances. I slowly took a sip of my coffee, looking down at her weeping form. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. You are a terrible actress. Jasmine, I stated, keeping my tone icy and entirely professional. You signed as the primary guarantor on his fraudulent tax returns. You happily wore diamond tiaras purchased with funds stolen from my late husband. You knew exactly where the money came from, and you loved every single second of the privilege it bought you. Jasmine scrambled to her feet, her tears flowing faster as she realized her victim routine was failing miserably. I will give you everything, she pleaded, stepping closer to the glass table. I will testify against Preston in federal court. Just please, Simone, give me a deal. Use your influence with the bank to protect my personal accounts. Tell the federal investigators I was just a clueless wife. Save me, and I will give you Preston on a silver platter. I stood up from my chair, closing my laptop with a sharp snap. I do not need your stolen passwords, Jasmine. I am a forensic accountant. I already possess every single routing number and hidden transaction Preston ever made. I have the master ledger from the Chicago vault. I do not need your testimony to bury your husband. Jasmine stared at me, her breath hitching in her throat. Please, Simone, she whispered, her voice cracking. We are family. We share the exact same blood. We are not family, I replied firmly, shutting down her manipulation instantly. When Darius died, you did not shed a single tear. You showed up to my cramped apartment 3 days after his funeral and tried to rip my wedding ring off my finger. You mocked his memory. You called him a struggling loser while you were actively funding your luxury lifestyle with the wealth he built from the ground up. You enabled a criminal and you danced on your own brother's grave. You actively participated in the ultimate betrayal against your own blood. You get absolutely no deals from me. When those words left my mouth, the desperate tears vanished from Jasmine's eyes. The pathetic weeping widow act completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a look of pure, unadulterated malice. Her face twisted into a vicious sneer, and she straightened her posture, dropping the fake humility entirely. You think you hold all the cards because you have some bank routing numbers? Jasmine hissed, her voice dripping with venom. You think you can just destroy my life and walk away untouched? I am his blood, Sister Simone. I have legal rights in this state that override yours. If you do not call off the federal agents and protect my assets right now, I will make you suffer in a way that money cannot fix. I raised an eyebrow, daring her to continue. I will go to the county courthouse today and file a petition to have Darius exhumed. Jasmine threatened, a wicked smile spreading across her face. As his immediate blood relative, I can claim his burial violated our family's religious practices. I will have his casket ripped out of the ground. I will have him cremated, and I will have his remains entirely discarded. You will never have a place to visit him again. Now I will erase his final resting place from the face of the earth. I will make sure his memory is thoroughly disgraced. She stood breathing heavily, expecting me to break down and surrender to her sickening emotional blackmail. She expected me to scream or cry or beg her to leave him alone. I did none of those things. I did not even flinch. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp, high-resolution photograph. I slid it face up across the glass dining table right in front of her. Jasmine looked down at the photograph. Look! Her wicked smile completely vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. The picture showed a freshly filled plot of dirt at the public cemetery. The gravestone was gone. The earth was empty. You cannot dig him up, Jasmine, I stated, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of mercy, because I exhumed his casket and moved his body to a heavily guarded private estate 48 hours ago. I knew exactly how evil you and your mother truly were, and I secured his resting place long before I ever went after your money. You have nothing, checkmate. Jasmine stared at the empty grave photograph, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. She snatched her designer purse and fled the hotel suite completely broken. The false kingdom she built was collapsing rapidly, and her mother was about to experience the exact same devastating reality. Across town at the ultra-exclusive Piedmont Country Club, Geraldine was completely oblivious to the financial slaughter taking place. She sat on the sunlit terrace wearing a vintage Chanel sun hat and sipping a $20 mimosa. She was holding court with three of the wealthiest socialites in Atlanta, loudly bragging about a fictional vacation she planned to take to the French Riviera. Geraldine thrived on projecting an image of untouchable black excellence, relying on the stolen Apex Holdings capital to maintain her flawless facade. The head waiter approached her table carrying a silver tray. He looked exceptionally nervous. Geraldine did not even look at him. She blindly reached into her designer handbag and tossed a platinum credit card onto the tray. "Put the entire brunch on my tab," she announced, waving her hand dismissively. "And bring us another bottle of your most expensive champagne." The waiter cleared his throat, leaning in close to avoid a scene. "I apologize, ma'am, but your card was declined." Geraldine froze mid-laugh. The three wealthy socialites at the table suddenly went dead silent, staring at her. "What did you just say?" Geraldine hissed, pulling down her sunglasses to glare. "At the young man, I am a platinum member here. My family practically built this dining room." "Run it again. I ran it 3 times, ma'am." The waiter whispered, his face flushing. "The bank instructed us to confiscate the card. The account has been permanently frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity." A collective gasp escaped the lips of her high society friends. The ultimate humiliation struck Geraldine like a physical blow. Her entire identity rested on her financial superiority, and it was disintegrating in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. She scrambled through her purse, pulling out a gold card, a corporate expense card, and a standard debit card. "Run all of them!" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. The waiter returned less than 2 minutes later, holding all her plastic cards. "Every single one has been declined and flagged," he stated loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "We need another form of payment for the $400 brunch bill." Geraldine stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, clattering loudly against the stone terrace. Her friends looked at her with pure disgust, realizing she was a complete fraud. She grabbed her purse and practically ran out of the country club, leaving her humiliated friends to cover the massive bill. Geraldine realized instantly that Preston had failed to secure the funds and that I had successfully cut off her lifeline. She did not go back to her mansion because she knew she had been evicted. Instead, she tracked me down, directly to the newly secured corporate headquarters of Apex Holdings. My security team alerted me the second she stepped into the lobby. "Let her up," I instructed through the intercom. "I want to see this." The heavy oak doors of the executive suite flew open. Geraldine barged in, looking nothing like the polished matriarch from the country club. Her hair was frizzy, her breathing heavy, and her face streaked with sweat. She looked frantically around my massive corner office, taking in the expensive artwork and the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. This was the office she thought belonged to her white son-in-law. Now I was sitting behind the mahogany desk. Simone Geraldine gasped, rushing toward my desk before the security guards could grab her. I waved the guards off, allowing her to step closer. Her demeanor shifted instantly. The arrogant bully who had called me a ghetto stray at her son's funeral was entirely gone. She forced tears into her eyes and placed her hands flat on my desk, adopting a tone of desperate solidarity. "Simone, you have to help me," Geraldine pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Preston is out of control. He is a white man who came in and corrupted our proud black family. He used his privilege to manipulate Darius, and he stole from all of us. I had no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. He took advantage of my trust. We are women of color, Simone. We have to stick together in a world that wants to tear us down. You cannot let that arrogant white boy destroy my legacy. We are family." I looked at my mother-in-law with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The sheer audacity of her racial deflection was nauseating. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Do not you dare try to weaponize our race to save your bank account?" I stated, my voice radiating pure ice. You did not care about my blackness when you called me a ghetto rat unfit for your son. You did not care about black solidarity when you treated the service workers in this city like garbage. You worshipped Preston because his whiteness and his corporate connections gave you proximity to power. You enabled him. You protected him. You gladly looked the other way, while he embezzled millions of dollars from your own son, just so you could buy designer bags and impress women who do not even like you. Geraldine stumbled backward, her fake tears drying up instantly. You cannot do this to me, she shrieked, her true toxic nature surfacing. I am your husband's mother. I gave him life. And you were fully prepared to take mine, I replied. Geraldine froze, her eyes darting toward the door. What are you talking about? She stammered. I reached across my desk and tapped the spacebar on my laptop, playing her recorded murder plot. The police are already on their way. Geraldine. The crisp audio file continued to play from my laptop, filling my executive office with her treacherous voice. Just get rid of Simone permanently so we can take the money, her recorded voice hissed. I do not care how you do it. Preston, just make it look like an accident and ensure that irrevocable trust defaults back to us. Geraldine fell backward onto the plush carpet, her designer handbag spilling its contents. She scrambled backward like a cornered animal, her eyes wide with absolute terror. You recorded my private phone calls. She gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I did not record anything. Geraldine, I replied, leaning over my mahogany desk. Preston recorded you. He keeps a digital archive of all his co-conspirators, just in case he ever needs a scapegoat. Your arrogant white son-in-law threw you under the bus when his offshore accounts froze. I used forensic software to crack his hidden cloud drive this morning. I forwarded that audio file to the district attorney. 10 minutes ago, attempted conspiracy carries a mandatory federal sentence. The wail of police sirens pierced the heavy silence, growing louder as squad cars pulled up. Geraldine let out a guttural scream of pure defeat. She clawed at the carpet, trying to drag herself toward the heavy oak doors, but her legs completely gave out. 2 armed federal agents burst into my suite, followed by building security. Geraldine Phelps, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and federal wire fraud, the lead agent announced, dragging her unceremoniously to her feet. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her manicured wrists. She did not look like a proud high society matriarch anymore. She looked exactly like the criminal she had always been. I watched them drag her screaming and sobbing into the elevator. One down, I whispered to myself, staring at the flashing red alerts on my monitor. Across town, inside a heavily secured luxury penthouse, Preston slammed his phone onto the marble kitchen counter. His highly paid corporate mole at the precinct had just tipped him off about Geraldine's immediate arrest. His breathing became ragged and shallow. The protective wall of his elite in-laws had completely crumbled, leaving him entirely exposed to the federal crosshairs. He knew the Internal Revenue Service was currently auditing his fake charities, and the district attorney was moving in for the kill. He had absolutely zero time left to play the privileged victim. Preston sprinted into his home office and threw open his floor safe. He grabbed 3 fake passports and a stack of untraceable bearer bonds. He powered up his encrypted laptop and bypassed the secondary firewalls to access the last remaining liquidity inside the Apex Holdings corporate shell. There was exactly $40 million sitting in a vulnerable holding account. It was the last of my late husband's stolen wealth. Preston typed frantically, his sweaty fingers slipping across the keyboard as he initiated a massive scorched earth protocol. He set up a rapid series of international wire transfers designed to siphon the $40 million through a dozen European clearinghouses and eventually into an untouchable Swiss bank account. Once the money cleared international waters, he would board his waiting private jet and vanish forever. I stared at my command terminal as the high-priority red alerts began flashing aggressively across my dual monitors. My proprietary financial tracking software immediately caught the unauthorized routing requests. "He is running," I said aloud, my fingers flying across my mechanical keyboard. The ultimate digital battle commenced right there in the silence of my office. Preston attempted to flood the network with decoy transactions, trying to confuse my security protocols and force the 40 million through the corporate gateways. He thought his expensive scrambling software could outsmart a certified forensic accountant who practically wrote the code for banking compliance. I did not even blink at his desperate tactics. I isolated his primary routing signature and built a digital cage around the outgoing funds. I reached into my titanium briefcase and pulled out the heavy black ledger I had secured from the Chicago vault. This ledger contained every single illegal transaction, every corrupt politician, and every dirty judge Preston had ever paid off. It was the ultimate key to destroying his financial safety net. I analyzed his outgoing requests alongside designated terrorist financing codes under the Patriot Act. I flagged his $40 million transfer as an international money laundering operation. I hit the execute button, transmitting the terrifying fraud alert directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security simultaneously. The immediate federal freeze slammed into Preston's accounts like a concrete wall. His screen turned black abruptly, severing his connection to the stolen millions. He screamed, hurling his laptop across the office where it shattered against the wall. He grabbed his fake passports and sprinted for the elevator. He did not care about the money anymore. He only cared about saving his skin. He arrived at the airstrip 30 minutes later, shoving past flight attendants and locking himself inside a Gulfstream jet. "Get this plane up right now!" Preston yelled, kicking the cockpit door. The jet roared down the runway, lifting into the dark sky. Just as federal vehicles breached the airport gates, Preston collapsed into a leather seat, pouring a glass of scotch. He looked out the window, watching city lights fade, laughing manically. He took a sip, believing he outsmarted me. Suddenly the jet banked violently, spilling scotch across his shirt. The intercom crackled to life. The pilot's voice trembled with absolute terror. "Sir, please remain seated," the pilot announced. "Air traffic control revoked our flight clearance. We have been ordered to turn around immediately." Preston rushed to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. Flying parallel to the Gulfstream, mere yards away, was a heavily armed military fighter jet. The ultimate trap had finally snapped completely shut. The heavy oak doors of my new executive office locked automatically as the large building transitioned into its quiet night mode. I stood completely alone in the pitch dark, surrounded by the soft blue glow of my server monitors. The arrest of Geraldine was just the opening move in a much larger war. I knew Preston better than he knew himself. He was a coward who hid behind his race and his corporate titles, but when cornered, a coward always implements a scorched earth protocol. A loud piercing alarm suddenly blared from my primary desktop computer. The screen flashed with bright red warning banners indicating an unauthorized mass extraction of corporate funds. Preston was recklessly bypassing the standard domestic banking gateways and utilizing an obsolete backdoor clearance code that Darius had carefully flagged in his hidden notes. He was trying to drain the last remaining $40 million of Apex Holdings capital and siphon it directly into a complex web of European shell companies controlled by his distant relatives. He was initiating these transfers while simultaneously fleeing the country on a private jet, hoping the transactions would clear international banking protocols before the authorities even noticed the money was missing. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and cracked my knuckles. Preston thought his expensive offshore banking software could outpace a certified forensic accountant who practically designed the compliance algorithms for these exact institutions. He was sorely mistaken. I launched my proprietary tracking programs and initiated a direct intercept on his routing numbers. The ultimate digital battle finally commenced in the complete silence of my office. A tense countdown appeared on my secondary monitor indicating we had exactly 19 minutes before the $40 million settled into an untouchable Swiss holding account. Preston was deploying hundreds of decoy transactions designed to flood the banking network and obscure the primary wire transfers. He was breaking the massive $40 million sum into thousands of smaller microtransactions, hoping to slip beneath the radar of the automated federal flagging systems. I did not waste time trying to block every single microtransaction. I targeted the central hub of his financial network. I rapidly typed lines of override code, isolating his primary routing signature and erecting a digital firewall around the outgoing capital. The tension in my chest tightened as the clock ticked down to 14 minutes. Preston was adapting in real time, switching his routing paths to bounce through servers in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. He was a desperate man fighting for his absolute survival, throwing every dirty trick he had learned into the digital void. He severely underestimated the arsenal I possessed. I reached under my desk and pulled out the heavy titanium briefcase I had brought back from the subterranean vault in Chicago. The steel latches clicked loudly in the quiet room as I opened it. I removed the thick black leather ledger that contained every single illegal transaction Preston had ever executed during his fraudulent tenure at Apex Holdings. I opened the ledger to the specific pages documenting his international money laundering operations. The names and account numbers listed in the precise handwriting of Darius provided the exact financial decryption keys I needed to shatter his firewall. I cross-referenced the offshore accounts in the ledger with the active routing numbers Preston was currently using to steal the $40 million. They were an exact match. I did not just have enough evidence to freeze his accounts. I had enough evidence to classify his entire operation as an international threat. I logged directly into the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network using my top-tier forensic credentials. I bypassed the standard civil fraud reporting channels and navigated straight to the highest level of national security alerts. I used the data from the Chicago Ledger to officially invoke the Patriot Act. I flagged every single one of his active wire transfers as a severe threat involving international money laundering and illicit offshore syndicates. I uploaded the supporting ledger pages directly to the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation databases. I hit the execute key and leaned back in my chair. The digital effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. My monitors lit up with green confirmation notices as the federal government slammed a global freeze on every single transaction bearing his financial signature. The $40 million stopped dead in its tracks, locked permanently in a federal holding pattern. I smiled, watching the countdown clock vanish from my screen, replaced by a message confirming complete asset seizure. The money was permanently safe, and the arrogant architect of his misery was entirely out of options. High above the cold, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, Preston sat comfortably in the luxurious cabin of a Gulfstream private jet. He had absolutely no idea his entire financial safety net had just been legally obliterated by the black woman he constantly belittled and mocked. He loosened his silk necktie and poured himself a generous glass of expensive aged scotch from the heavy crystal decanter resting on the polished wooden table. He kicked his expensive shoes up onto the pristine leather seat across from him, feeling incredibly smug and victorious. He honestly believed he had successfully stolen $40 million and permanently escaped the crumbling ruins of his fraudulent life in Atlanta. He took a slow, satisfied sip of the amber liquid, savoring the sweet taste of his perceived triumph over me. He closed his eyes, completely ready to start a new wealthy life in Europe, entirely free from any legal consequences or federal scrutiny. The peaceful, relaxing silence of the luxury cabin was suddenly broken by the sharp, loud crackle of the overhead intercom system. The pilot cleared his throat, sounding unusually tense and frightened. "Sir, Air Traffic Control has just revoked our international flight clearance and ordered us to turn around immediately," the pilot announced, his voice shaking with raw, undeniable terror. "We are being intercepted by federal fighter jets." The military escort forced Preston to land his private jet at a heavily guarded federal airstrip outside Atlanta. Heavily armed agents dragged him off the tarmac in handcuffs, but his panic was entirely short-lived. Preston was a master of leveraging his white privilege and utilizing the corrupt network of wealthy elites he had cultivated for years. Within 4 hours, a dark money syndicate posted his massive bail, and he walked right out of federal custody wearing a smug, arrogant smile. He was temporarily grounded, but he was far from defeated. Knowing the federal criminal investigation would take months to build a rock-solid prosecution, Preston decided to launch a vicious civil counterattack to drain my resources and break my spirit. He immediately filed a massive $50 million civil lawsuit against me, alleging corporate espionage, identity theft, and the malicious hijacking of Apex Holdings. He hired the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firm in the entire state of Georgia. Their lead attorney was a notorious bulldog named Richard Sterling, a man famous for mentally destroying his opponents in the deposition room before a case ever reached a judge. 2 weeks later, I sat in a freezing conference room at Richard's law firm, surrounded by walls of expensive leather-bound legal volumes. A court reporter sat silently in the corner, typing every single syllable. Preston sat across the massive oak table, glaring at me with pure malice. He actually believed his high-priced legal mercenary was going to rip me to shreds. Richard slammed a stack of fabricated evidence onto the table and immediately began his aggressive interrogation. He did not bother asking about the corporate financials. Instead, he went straight for my throat, attacking my background to paint me as an uneducated, emotional, and deeply incompetent widow. He aggressively questioned my working-class upbringing in Chicago, demanding to know how a woman with my meager background could possibly comprehend the complex corporate structure of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. He paced around the room, raising his voice to intimidate me. "You are nothing but a low-level bookkeeper handling petty cash," Richard stated, sneering at my tailored suit. "You manipulated a grieving family, hacked into a corporate mainframe you barely understand, and stole my client's proprietary data because you were bitter that your late husband died penniless. You are completely out of your depth, Simone, and we are going to bury you." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show any emotional fragility he was desperately trying to provoke. I calmly folded my hands on the oak table and looked directly into Richard's eyes. "I am not just a widow," I replied, my voice radiating freezing authority. "And I am certainly not a low-level bookkeeper. I am a certified forensic accountant who spent a decade unraveling offshore tax evasion schemes for federal regulatory agencies before meeting my husband. I am acting as my own expert witness today, and I am going to dismantle your entire fabricated lawsuit right now." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own stack of heavily audited financial records, spreading them across the table. I did not rely on emotional appeals. I used brutal, undeniable forensic math. I pointed to the first document. On October 14th at 2 in the morning, Preston utilized a proxy server located in the Cayman Islands to bypass the Apex Holdings internal firewall. I listed the precise internet protocol addresses from memory. He executed a wire transfer of $4.2 million, routing it through a shell company registered to his current mistress. I moved to the second document. On November 22nd, he altered the corporate profit and loss statements, covering up a massive deficit by classifying personal yacht maintenance as a deductible commercial real estate expense. I went line by line, transaction by transaction, exposing every single fraudulent keystroke Preston had ever made. I rattled off dates, times, routing numbers, and the exact encrypted passwords he thought he had deleted. The smirk vanished from Richard's face. The bulldog attorney stopped pacing and sank into his leather chair, staring at the undeniable mathematical proof spread across the table. Preston began to sweat, shifting in his seat as he realized his expensive legal shield was useless against my flawless forensic reconstruction. He thought he could bully me into submission, but he walked blindly into a crafted trap. Richard cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the deposition, but his voice lacked its previous venom. "These documents are circumstantial," Richard stammered weakly. "They do not prove my client engaged in systematic corporate theft." I smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. I knew Richard would try to deflect, so I saved my best piece of evidence for the grand finale. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out an unmarked manila folder. I slid the folder slowly across the oak table until it rested directly in front of the lead attorney. "I highly suggest you open that, Richard," I instructed, my tone devoid of mercy. "Because that document has nothing to do with Preston's corporate theft. It has everything to do with you." Richard flipped the folder open. He stared at the sheet of paper inside, and the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His hands began to shake violently as he read the highlighted bank routing numbers. He stood up, slamming the folder shut and packing his legal documents into his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded in panic. Richard zipped his briefcase and looked at Preston with disgust. "I withdraw as counsel," Richard announced, backing away from the table. The court reporter stopped typing. Preston sat in stunned silence as his powerful lawyer practically ran out of the room. He had no idea that the folder contained absolute proof that his multi-million-dollar legal retainer was paid using stolen pension funds, entirely implicating his own lawyer in federal money laundering. The heavy oak doors of the deposition room slammed shut, leaving Preston isolated in the freezing conference center. He was exposed to the brutal reality of federal prosecution. He stared at the empty leather chair where his lawyer had been sitting seconds ago. Panic finally pierced through his impenetrable wall of arrogance. He grabbed his briefcase and sprinted out of the law firm. He needed to get back to the Apex Holdings skyscraper immediately. He knew the district attorney would not wait for a formal indictment now that his legal counsel had fled in terror. He had to destroy the physical evidence before authorities swarmed his corporate fortress. Preston drove his luxury sedan recklessly through downtown Atlanta traffic, running red lights and nearly sideswiping public transit buses. He pulled into the underground executive garage and took the private elevator directly to his penthouse office. He burst through his doors, sweating profusely. He marched straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows. His heart dropped into his stomach. A massive coordinated convoy of unmarked black tactical vehicles was aggressively pulling up to the glittering glass skyscraper. Dozens of armed federal agents wearing tactical vests with the Internal Revenue Service and district attorney insignias stamped across their backs poured out of the vehicles. They were moving with absolute military precision, completely locking down every single exit and entrance to the building. The raid was officially underway. Preston backed away from the window, his chest heaving with raw terror. He refused to go to federal prison. He refused to let me win. He ran to his mahogany desk and entered a frantic code into his hidden floor safe. The heavy steel door popped open, revealing stacks of black ledgers and rows of encrypted backup hard drives. These were the true, unedited financial records that documented every single shell company, every bribed official, and every stolen dollar he had funneled out of Apex Holdings. Preston grabbed a heavy brass statue from his desk and smashed the external hard drives into pieces. He hurled the shattered plastic components into the hidden high-temperature incinerator built into the wall of his private lounge. He flipped the ignition switch, watching the digital evidence melt into a puddle of sludge. But the physical ledgers were the real threat. The federal agents were already breaching the lobby downstairs. Security alarms blared throughout the entire skyscraper. Preston grabbed the massive stack of black leather ledgers and sprinted toward the heavy-duty industrial shredder. He jammed the thick parchment pages into the grinding metal teeth. The machine roared to life viciously, chewing through the damning financial records and spitting them out as white confetti into the bin. He fed book after book into the shredder, his manicured hands slicing against the sharp paper edges. He did not care. He was destroying the very foundation of my forensic case against him. The sound of heavy tactical boots echoed down the executive hallway. The agents were clearing the floor. Preston grabbed the very last ledger from the safe. He ripped the binding apart and shoved the final cluster of pages into the roaring shredder. He stumbled backward, collapsing into his leather executive chair. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and began to laugh. The laugh started as a low chuckle and quickly escalated into a hysterical roar. He had done it. He had destroyed the only physical proof of his massive financial crimes. He believed his white-collar image would easily protect him now that the paper trail was completely annihilated. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the penthouse office violently shattered inward. The glass exploded across the imported rug as 6 heavily armed federal agents breached the room. They fanned out instantly, aiming their weapons directly at his chest. "Keep your hands exactly where we can see them," the lead agent commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Step away from the desk and get on the ground right now." Preston did not get on the ground. He slowly raised his hands in the air, keeping his arrogant posture intact. The manic laughter still bubbled in his throat. "You are making a massive mistake bursting into my private office," Preston yelled. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation. You have no right to be here and you have nothing on me. I want my lawyer and I want you out of my building. You can search every single inch of this office, but you will not find a single shred of evidence to support your witch hunt." The federal agents did not lower their weapons. The lead agent simply stepped aside, clearing a path through the shattered doorway. The room fell dead silent, except for the humming of the industrial shredder. I stepped into the penthouse office, walking right behind the line of federal agents. I wore a pristine white tailored suit that radiated total dominance. I looked at the melted hard drives in the incinerator and the massive pile of shredded confetti overflowing from the bin. Preston glared at me, a vicious smile of triumph plastered across his sweaty face. "You are too late, Simone," Preston sneered, dropping his hands to point at the shredder. "Every single document is gone. Your entire forensic case just turned into dust. You cannot prove a single thing." I calmly walked toward the center of the room, stepping over the broken glass. I did not show an ounce of defeat. I offered him a cold, merciless smile. The federal agents tightened their grip on their weapons as they watched his arrogant expression completely crumble into pure, undeniable terror. "You are exactly right, Preston," I replied, my voice echoing with lethal certainty. "You definitely shredded those documents." I raised my hand and pointed to a stack of cardboard boxes sitting quietly in the corner of his office. "But those were just the fake decoy ledgers I swapped into your safe last night using my building access codes. The real ledgers are right there." Preston stared at the pristine boxes sitting untouched in the corner of his executive suite. The crushing reality of his complete and absolute financial destruction finally pierced his previously untouchable and incredibly arrogant shell. He let out a primal scream of rage and lunged forward, trying to bypass the federal agents to get his hands on my physical evidence. He did not make it 2 steps. The lead agent grabbed Preston by the collar of his expensive tailored suit and spun him around with brutal efficiency. The agent slammed Preston chest first onto the polished mahogany desk. The impact sent a gold nameplate flying across the room and shattering against the hardwood floor. "You are officially under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive international money laundering," the agent stated, his voice echoing across the room like a cold mechanical boom. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Preston's wrists, binding his hands tightly behind his back. The sudden absolute panic radiating wildly in his wide eyes was incredibly intoxicating for me to witness firsthand. He thrashed against the agents, trying to leverage his physical size, but the tactical team held him down effortlessly. "This is a setup," Preston yelled, his face turning a blotchy red as he pressed his cheek against the cold wood of his desk. "I am the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. My lawyers will strip you of your badges. You have no idea the kind of political connections I possess. I will ruin all of you." I walked over to the desk and picked up the shattered gold nameplate. I tossed it directly into the trash bin where the shredded confetti of his fake documents still rested. "You do not have any lawyers left." "Preston?" I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. "I showed your lead counsel exactly how you funded his legal retainer. He withdrew from your case an hour ago to save his own skin. You have no connections, and you certainly have no power. You are just a criminal who finally ran out of other people's money to steal." The federal agents yanked Preston to his feet and began frog-marching him out of the penthouse office. I followed very closely behind him, proudly holding my head high as we slowly entered the brightly lit main executive hallway. The stunning scene waiting outside the penthouse office was a perfect display of absolute poetic justice. Every single employee of Apex Holdings had stepped out of their cubicles and glass offices, drawn by the blaring security alarms and the swarm of tactical gear. These were the same hard-working people Preston had routinely tormented, underpaid, and threatened with termination whenever he needed to assert his fragile ego. Now they stood in complete silence, watching their tyrant boss get dragged through the corridors in handcuffs. Preston tried to hide his face, bowing his head to avoid the burning stares of his staff. He was entirely stripped of his corporate armor. The whispering began immediately as the employees pulled out their phones, capturing his ultimate humiliation in high-definition video. The agents marched him onto the executive elevator, and we descended rapidly to the grand marble lobby. The flashing blue and red lights from dozens of squad cars illuminated the glass facade of the skyscraper. Just as the elevator doors chimed open, a chaotic shrieking echoed across the expansive lobby. Jasmine burst through the revolving front doors wearing a heavy designer fur coat and clutching a luxury handbag. She had completely bypassed the police barricades outside, utilizing her usual tactic of screaming until someone surrendered. She saw Preston in handcuffs, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. "Get your filthy hands off my husband," Jasmine shrieked, sprinting across the marble floor toward the federal agents. She wildly swung her designer handbag, attempting to physically strike the lead agent. "You cannot arrest him. Do you have any idea who we are? We are the most powerful family in Atlanta. I will call the governor right now and have all of your badges stripped. You are making the biggest mistake of your miserable working-class lives." The lead agent did not even flinch at her hysterical threats. He calmly handed Preston over to a secondary tactical unit and pulled a heavy clipboard from his vest. He flipped through a stack of federal warrants, his expression entirely bored by her elite temper tantrum. "Are you Miss Jasmine Phelps, the lead agent?" asked, his tone remaining completely and utterly flat. "Yes, I am," Jasmine yelled, puffing out her chest and pointing a perfectly manicured finger at his face. "And you are going to release my husband this exact second, or I will personally ensure you never work in law enforcement again." The lead agent unclipped a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Jasmine Phelps, you are under arrest," the agent announced, grabbing her outstretched wrist and twisting her arm behind her back. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling scream of pure shock as the cold metal locked around her wrists. She thrashed wildly, her expensive fur coat slipping off her shoulders and falling onto the dirty lobby floor. The designer handbag she cherished so much spilled its contents across the marble. "For what?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice breaking into a desperate, panicked sob as the agents forced her to stand next to her humiliated husband. "Tell me, what did I even do wrong? I am a completely innocent woman." I walked slowly across the lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, until I stood directly in front of her. I looked at the tears streaming down her face and offered her a freezing, merciless smile. For signing as the primary guarantor on his fraudulent tax returns, I answered quietly, ensuring every single word pierced her fragile, delusional reality. "Enjoy federal prison, Jasmine." The heavy glass doors of the lobby slid shut behind the federal agents as they dragged Jasmine and Preston into the flashing lights of the waiting squad cars. I stood silently on the marble floor, watching the empire. They stole, crumble into dust. My phone buzzed in my pocket, signaling the automatic execution of my next digital directive. With both the fraudulent chief executive officer and his primary guarantor sitting in federal holding cells, the house of cards protecting my mother-in-law instantly collapsed. The offshore accounts were seized. The illegal credit lines were severed. Geraldine was completely destitute. Across town at the towering high-rise of the Buckhead luxury penthouses, the reality of her financial slaughter was arriving in the form of federal bank liquidators. Geraldine had spent the last 48 hours desperately trying to swipe her rejected platinum cards at every high-end boutique in Atlanta, completely oblivious to the fact that her name was now on a federal watch list. When the banks officially seized her stolen assets, she rushed back to her multi-million-dollar penthouse, only to find an eviction notice taped to the front door. The property was owned by Apex Holdings, and I had explicitly ordered the immediate termination of her lease. But Geraldine refused to accept her new reality. She was a woman who built her entire identity on projecting an image of untouchable elite excellence, relying on stolen wealth to demand respect from a society she felt entitled to rule. She ripped the eviction notice off the door and barricaded herself inside the sprawling penthouse. She shoved heavy velvet sofas and antique marble tables against the entryway, deadbolting every single lock. The building management called me directly, reporting that she was throwing violent tantrums and threatening to destroy the property. If anyone tried to remove her, I told them to stand down and pull their security team back. I wanted to handle the arrogant squatter myself. I arrived at the penthouse suite 2 hours later, stepping off the private elevator with a single security guard holding a master override key. The hallway was dead silent, but I could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of Geraldine destroying the interior of the apartment. She was tearing through her massive walk-in closet, shoving thousands of dollars worth of designer dresses and limited edition handbags into luxury suitcases she no longer owned. My security guard inserted the override key and bypassed the deadbolts with a heavy mechanical click. I pushed the door open and stepped over the barricade of velvet furniture. The penthouse was completely trashed. Smashed crystal glasses littered the floor, and expensive artwork hung crookedly on the walls. Geraldine stood in the center of the living room, clutching a rare crocodile skin handbag to her chest, like a protective shield. Her hair was a messy, tangled disaster, and her designer silk blouse was stained with spilled red wine. She looked nothing like the arrogant matriarch who had called me a ghetto rat just a few short weeks ago. "Get out of my house!" Geraldine shrieked, her voice cracking with raw panic as she backed away toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You cannot do this to me, Simone. I am a respected woman of high society. I sit on the board of 3 different country clubs. I am untouchable. You are just a bitter, vindictive little girl, trying to ruin my proud family legacy. I demand you leave my property right now." I slowly walked across the room, my heels crunching against the broken crystal. "You do not have a legacy, Geraldine," I stated, my voice radiating freezing authority. "You have a criminal record and a mountain of unpaid debt. Preston and Jasmine are currently sitting in federal holding cells, waiting for their arraignment on massive wire fraud charges. The banks have seized every single asset you claim to own. Your country club friends will not even answer your phone calls because your face is plastered. Across the evening news, you are entirely bankrupt and you are trespassing on my property." The sheer absolute truth of my words hit her like a physical blow. The delusion she had been desperately clinging to shattered completely. She dropped the heavy crocodile handbag, letting it hit the floor with a dull thud. Her knees buckled, giving out entirely under the crushing weight of her immediate reality. Geraldine collapsed onto the hardwood floor, dropping to her knees right in front of me. The arrogant facade vanished completely, replaced by the pathetic weeping of a broken, desperate woman who finally realized she had absolutely nothing left. "Simone, please," Geraldine sobbed loudly, clasping her shaking hands together as tears streamed down her ruined makeup. "I have nowhere to go. My friends abandoned me. The bank took my accounts. Please do not put me out on the street. I will do anything you want. I will make public apologies. I will tell the judge. Preston forced me to sign those documents. Just please let me stay here. I am begging you. Please show me some mercy." I looked down at the weeping woman who had tormented my late husband and mocked my working-class background. She expected me to call the police and have her dragged out in handcuffs, just like her arrogant daughter. She expected a public humiliation, but sending her to a comfortable white-collar prison cell was too easy for the pain she had purposely caused. Darius. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 specific items. I dropped a wooden mop handle onto the floor, right next to her trembling knees. Then I dropped a single sheet of paper directly on top of it. It was a standard minimum wage employment contract. "I am not calling the police," I said, my voice perfectly flat. "You can stay in this building, Geraldine. As the night shift janitor, your shift starts at 8 p.m. tonight. Do not be late, or you are fired permanently. Understand?" 6 months later, the federal trial of Preston and Jasmine commenced in downtown Atlanta. News vans lined the blocked-off streets with reporters shouting questions as my private security team escorted me through the blinding flashes of camera lenses. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray power suit, radiating the absolute authority of a woman who had successfully secured her late husband's empire. I walked into the crowded courtroom and took my seat directly behind the federal prosecutors. Preston and Jasmine were already seated at the defense table looking like pale shadows of their former arrogant selves. Preston wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit because the government had successfully seized every single dollar of his stolen wealth. Jasmine sat beside him trembling and refusing to make eye contact with the packed gallery. The trial began with an aggressive and utterly desperate opening statement from Preston's exhausted public defender. Having zero financial evidence to counter my forensic paper trail, the defense attorney attempted a ridiculous psychological distress plea. He paced in front of the jury box, dramatically waving his hands, and claiming that Preston was a victim of severe corporate pressure. The lawyer argued the immense stress of running a massive real estate firm fractured Preston's mental state, driving him into temporary financial insanity. Jasmine hired a separate bargain basement attorney who immediately threw her husband under the bus. Her lawyer painted Jasmine as a clueless, battered wife who was completely terrified of Preston and had absolutely no idea that she was signing fraudulent tax returns. It was a pathetic, coordinated theatrical performance designed entirely to manipulate the emotions of the jury. I sat in the gallery taking meticulous notes on my tablet, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for either of them. When the federal prosecutor finally called me to the witness stand, the entire courtroom went completely dead silent. I walked up to the podium, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the absolute truth. I did not rely on theatrical tears or emotional manipulation to make my case. I used brutal forensic mathematics. For 4 grueling hours, I systematically dismantled every lie the defense attorneys had desperately spun. I projected the digital metadata from the backdated fraudulent will onto the massive courtroom screens, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Jasmine actively and enthusiastically participated in the scheme to steal my $83 million inheritance. When the defense attorney attempted to cross-examine me, he aggressively questioned my accounting credentials, trying to frame me as a bitter, grieving widow who was simply out for personal revenge. I leaned into the microphone and shut him down instantly. "I am not seeking revenge," I stated, my voice echoing with freezing clarity across the massive room. "I am executing justice for a brilliant black man who was maliciously exploited by an arrogant white fraudster." I then submitted my ultimate weapon into the federal record. I handed the prosecutor the heavy black leather ledger I had retrieved from the subterranean vault in Chicago. The prosecutor handed it directly to the jury foreman. I walked the jury through every line of the ledger, pinpointing the exact dates, times, and routing numbers of Preston's massive international money laundering operation. I showed them how Preston used his racial privilege to navigate elite banking circles while draining the lifeblood out of a company my husband built from the ground up. To deliver the final devastating blow, the prosecutor dimmed the courtroom lights and played the video confession Darius had recorded just 2 days before his heart failed. My late husband's strong, steady voice filled the silent room, meticulously detailing how Preston and Jasmine had conspired to ruin his legacy. Several jurors actually gasped out loud as they listened to the undeniable truth speaking directly from the grave. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating when closing arguments finally concluded. Preston's public defender sat at the defense table looking incredibly smug. He whispered to Preston, looking highly confident his theatrical presentation of psychological distress had planted just enough reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds to avoid a maximum sentence. Jasmine was quietly weeping into a tissue, still desperately trying to sell her fabricated, clueless wife routine to anyone who would pay attention. The judge formally instructed the jury and dismissed them to the deliberation room. Federal financial fraud cases of this massive magnitude typically took several days or even weeks for a jury to fully untangle and deliberate. The defense team packed up their briefcases, expecting to go home for the weekend. I did not leave the courthouse. I sat perfectly still in the front row, watching the heavy wooden door of the deliberation room. I knew exactly how airtight my forensic evidence was. I knew the mathematical truth could never be defeated by cheap courtroom theatrics. My absolute confidence was completely validated when the wooden door swung open less than 45 minutes later. The entire courtroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked whispers as the 12 jurors filed quickly back into the jury box. The defense attorney dropped his pen, his smug confidence instantly evaporating into pure undeniable terror. Preston began to violently shake his face, turning a sickly gray. Jasmine let out a loud, terrified sob, clutching the edge of the defense table with white knuckles. The judge banged his heavy, solid wooden gavel, demanding order in the hushed court. He looked directly at the jury box, his expression entirely stern and uncompromising. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice booming through the room. The jury foreman, a tall, older black man holding the verdict sheet, stood up. He looked at Preston and then directly at me, offering a respectful nod. "We have your honor," the foreman announced, projecting his deep, steady voice so every single eager reporter standing in the gallery could hear him perfectly clear. On all 45 counts of massive corporate wire fraud, international embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy to commit theft, we completely find the defendants guilty. 2 weeks after that devastating guilty verdict echoed through the federal courthouse, the sentencing hearing officially commenced. The packed room was suffocatingly quiet as the federal judge adjusted his glasses and looked down from his high bench with disdain. Preston stood with his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the hardwood floor. The judge did not mince his words. He called Preston's actions a calculated and deeply malicious violation of public trust and family loyalty. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding crack as the judge handed Preston 25 long consecutive years in federal prison without parole. He would spend his life behind concrete walls, stripped of the corporate power and unearned privilege he had weaponized against my husband. Jasmine stood next to him, physically shaking, as the judge turned his attention to her. She tried to produce a few final tears, but the judge cut her off immediately. For her active role as the primary financial guarantor of the massive fraud, Jasmine received a mandatory sentence of 7 years in a federal penitentiary. As the federal marshals moved in to physically shackle Preston and Jasmine for their transport to the penitentiary, a slight movement in the back row of the public gallery caught my eye. It was Geraldine. She was sitting alone in the very last row, far from the socialites she once ruled. She wore a faded gray wool coat that looked at least a decade old, a jarring contrast to the designer silk she once flaunted. Her shoulders were hunched, and her face was deeply lined with the exhaustion of someone who had lost absolutely everything. She clutched a cheap plastic thermos in her lap. She watched her daughter and son-in-law dragged away in chains, but did not scream or cry. She simply stood up, adjusting the collar of her faded coat, and quietly shuffled out the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. She had to leave early because her night shift as the janitor at my corporate headquarters started in exactly 1 hour, and she knew I would fire her without hesitation if she was a single minute late. I gathered my leather briefcase and walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, feeling the weight lifting off my shoulders. When I pushed through the bronze doors of the federal courthouse, the blinding afternoon sun hit my face perfectly. A massive crowd of media personnel and eager journalists was waiting at the bottom of the grand concrete front steps. Microphones were shoved aggressively in my direction as reporters shouted my name, begging for a statement regarding the sentencing. I did not stop walking. I did not offer them a single quote or a victorious smile. I simply adjusted my sunglasses and descended the wide steps flanked by my private security team. They parted the chaotic sea of reporters, clearing a direct path to the curb where a pristine jet-black Rolls-Royce was waiting with its engine quietly purring. My driver opened the heavy rear door. I slid into the luxurious leather interior and the vehicle smoothly pulled away, leaving the media circus eating our dust as we headed straight toward the financial district. The war was officially over, but my real work was just beginning. Over the next 6 months, I completely dismantled the toxic corporate culture Preston built. I executed a massive rebranding campaign, stripping the Apex Holdings name from every single skyscraper billboard and legal document in Atlanta. The corporation was officially reborn and legally restructured as Darius Legacy Partners. I replaced the corrupt board of directors with brilliant financial minds who understood community investment. But building a massive real estate empire was only half of the mission Darius envisioned. I took $20 million of the recovered capital and established a heavily endowed philanthropic foundation designed to fund financial literacy programs and provide venture capital for underprivileged Black youth entrepreneurs across Georgia. I built training facilities and hired forensic accountants to teach young adults exactly how to protect their wealth. I made absolutely certain that no one in our community would ever be legally or financially exploited the way my brilliant husband was. 1 year after the trial concluded, I found myself standing alone in the corner executive suite at the top of the Darius Legacy Partners skyscraper. The sun was setting over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm golden glow through the glass windows. The city looked incredibly peaceful from this high up. I walked over to the custom mahogany wet bar and poured a measure of expensive rare-aged bourbon into a heavy crystal glass. The ice clinked softly as I walked back to my massive leather executive chair. I sat down, placing the bourbon on the polished wood of my desk. Right in the center, resting in a thick silver frame, was the only photograph of Darius I kept in the office. He was smiling brightly, looking incredibly handsome, and completely carefree. It was taken years ago on a cheap disposable camera, back when we lived in that cramped one-bedroom apartment, completely unaware of the massive financial empire he was secretly building to protect me. I reached out and gently turned the silver frame so the photograph of Darius was facing the spectacular glowing skyline of the city he had silently conquered. I took a slow sip of the warm bourbon, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace wash over my entire soul. The ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest, and the future was entirely in my command. I looked at the photograph one last time. They told me I was nothing but a ghetto rat trying to steal their world. They were wrong. I absolutely did not steal their world. I took what was yours, Darius, and now I run it. The brilliant, warm, golden light of the setting sun slowly faded from the expansive glass windows, slowly plunging the majestic executive suite into a deep and comforting darkness. The ultimate lesson from this intense family drama is that true power stems from quiet resilience and total financial independence rather than loud arrogance. When dealing with toxic relatives who constantly weaponize their privilege and attempt to gaslight your reality, the best revenge is never a screaming match. Instead, it is meticulously building your own undeniable empire in the shadows. Silence is a brilliant strategy, and massive success is your ultimate weapon. True strength always lies in completely outsmarting those who foolishly underestimate your worth. If you love this story, subscribe now and share your thoughts with us down below.